Wind came off the lake hard enough to lift spray into a fine grit that stung the face. The boat struck the shingle and scraped forward, and the men in it jumped out to drag her higher before the next wave shoved her sideways. Across the water, a storm still sulked on the horizon, the kind that leaves the air metallic and makes speech carry farther than it should. On shore, the rocks gave way to a low rise studded with tombs, dry chambers cut into the hillside, doors of rough stone leaned aside or missing. From one of those openings, a figure burst out and ran, bare feet slapping stone, hair clotted with dust. He shouted words that came out of him in many voices at once. The fishermen froze the way men do when a threat is coming fast and they still have one hand on the rope. The teacher they called Jesus stepped forward. The man from the tombs closed the distance and then dropped, chest heaving, face to the ground. His wrists were scarred and smooth in places where chain had rubbed skin flat. No one in that district slept easy. People knew the sound of iron broken at night, the clatter of a stone being hurled in the dark, the echo of a cry that was more than one voice at once. They had bound him when they could and kept watch when they couldn't, but he always found a way to tear free. He lived where the dead did because the living had given up trying to persuade him to stay. "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" he said without lifting his head. "Don't torment me." It came out like a shout strangled into a whisper. Jesus told the spirit to come out. The man's back went rigid. His fingers dug into the wet grit, as if he were trying to hold on to the earth itself. "What is your name?" Jesus asked. "Legion," the voices said, "for we are many." The word had a soldier's weight. It meant numbers. It meant a mass no ordinary net could hold. On the slope beyond the tombs, a herd of pigs moved in a scrim of dust, thousands of backs like a field of pale stones rolling. Swineherds kept their distance from the tombs and from the shore. They had learned to steer clear of both. Some had already stopped and were watching the shore the way people watch a fight begin, part fear, part an urge not to miss what others will later say they saw. The voices begged, not for release, not for the open air, but for a transfer. "Let us go into the pigs." The request was practical in a way that felt colder than the wind. It was the kind of bargain a cornered man makes when he sees a door and will take any key that fits. Jesus gave permission. What happened next did not look like theater. There was no show to it. The man on the ground slackened, his muscles gone from iron to empty rope. He sucked in a breath like someone who had been held under too long and then lay there blinking up at a sky that finally looked like a sky and not a lid. At the same moment, the herd on the slope convulsed into movement, first a ripple, then full panic. The animals bunched and drove forward as if some hand behind them had shoved. Swineherds shouted and waved their staves the way you do when you still think you can turn a flood with your arms. The pigs took the slope in a single rolling motion, overwhelmed the men at the front, burst across a strip of rock, and threw themselves into the water. The sound carried, hooves clattering, bodies hitting waves, men yelling the names they called the animals when they wanted them to obey. The lake went white with churn. Then it went quiet except for the slap of water against shore and the wind pushing ripples back over the place where the herd had been. Bits of foam and air bubbled to the surface. A piece of wood that had been a pen post spun and drifted. The number the herdsman would later swear to, 2,000, felt believable when you looked at the empty slope and at the space the herd had filled only moments earlier. The man who had come from the tombs sat up slowly, then awkwardly pulled his knees under him. He touched his wrists and stared at his palms like they belonged to someone else. Someone threw a cloak over his shoulders. The fishermen stood in a half circle, as alert as if the sky might throw down another storm. Jesus watched the man, the way doctors watch a patient for the moment when pain stops trying to climb and begins to come down. The swineherds ran. They ran first to the nearest hamlet and then to the larger town, talking as they went so that by the time they reached the square, their words were stacked on top of each other. People grabbed shawls and staves and came to see if the telling matched what the land would show. A crowd formed by the shore, men with calloused hands and women with wet hair caught back from washing, boys who were supposed to be at the stalls but had slipped away. They found the man sitting dressed, the cloak pinned close, hair combed by a stranger's fingers. He looked younger. He looked like the outline from a missing person notice, as if the damage had been a shadow that was finally stepping off the body people used to know. The crowd's first emotion was a kind of suspended disbelief. Eyes flicked from the man to the teacher and back. Then someone said the number again out loud. 2,000 pigs. Every ear caught it. That was money. That was meat and trade and dowries made possible. It was men who had counted on a season now counting the loss in their heads. A woman pressed her lips together and looked down at the wet hem of her dress. A man did the math you do without realizing your jaw has set. Fear came next, and not because the man was dangerous anymore. Fear arrived because power had moved through their ground and proved it could take what it wanted. They asked Jesus to leave. They didn't shout. They didn't bring stones. They said it like people who have seen enough. Please go. The phrasing was polite the way a shut door can be polite if it closes slowly. There are places where deliverance is welcomed like rain. There are places where it is weighed against the books of the day. Jesus turned toward the boat. The man who had been among the tombs followed, hand out, as if he needed to keep a grip on the only solid thing left. "Let me come with you," he said, voice low and urgent. He didn't have a house to return to or a job to pick up. He had a trail of broken chain and a catalog of nights spent howling at rock. "Go home to your people," Jesus said, "and tell them what the Lord has done for you and how he had mercy on you." It wasn't dismissal. It was deployment. Not everyone is sent across water. Some are sent across the street. The man nodded hard like someone agreeing with a sentence he hadn't known he could live. He stood on the shore while the boat pushed off. For a beat, he seemed to reconsider and looked back the way people look back at rooms they've just left forever. Then he turned toward the villages of the Decapolis, 10 towns strung like beads along roads of trade, and began to talk. He didn't add flourishes. He didn't edit out the ugly parts. He pointed to the tombs, to the slope where the herd had torn itself to pieces, and to his own wrists. People listened. The same men who had said, "Please leave," listened when rumor came back round in a different voice. By the time the boat was a dark shape on the water, a loose hearing had formed on the shore. Someone asked the swineherds whether the animals had turned together as if driven by one mind, whether there had been any sound besides the rush and the breaking of water. One man said he had heard something like a sigh run through the herd. Another swore that the first dead pig rose and spun in the chop like a log. The details multiplied. They always do. The truth stood there in daylight. A man who had terrorized himself and everyone around him now calm, and a herd that had put itself into the deep as if it knew the way without being taught. Days later, when the teacher returned by the same sea, people met him with stretchers and questions, with hands lifted and hands clenched, with hope and with a ledger of what they could afford to lose. The man who had been freed had already covered ground. In town after town, he told the same plain account. "I was in the tombs. I broke chains. I cut myself. He came. He spoke. The thing in me left. If you need the rest, look at the water." The hillside did not keep a scar. Snow would come in its season and leave again. The marks that remained were on wrists and in the way a mother stopped starting at every noise in the night. The drowned herd became a line told with a shrug or with a shaking head depending on who had owned what. The decision to ask a healer to leave sat in people's mouths like a taste they couldn't spit or swallow. but the story of the man who stayed, sane and clothed and moving from village to village, kept traveling faster than any boat could. The fishermen who had watched from the shoreline would remember the silence after the splash more than the splash itself. They would remember the way the newly freed man breathed. They would remember how a single permission spoken on a shore carried a weight nothing else on that ground could match. And they would remember that after the crowd sent Jesus away, he left behind a witness planted in the very place that had feared what it had just seen. It turned out mercy could live there even when comfort said it could not. Thank you for listening to Divine Crime. Subscribe for more true stories from the most dangerous book ever written.